So, I think we're ready. If that's okay, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna go ahead and start this mother. Hello, and welcome to Hempfest Symposium. This is our panel on marijuana and the media. I want to first introduce our panelists. We have some tremendous people on the panel today, and of course, our moderator is Steve Bloom. I'm going to go through our panelists first in reverse order. Their names would be rather difficult to pronounce, so I'm going to go from front to from left to right instead. First off, we have Angela Bacca. Angela is a Southern California-based freelance journalist, writer, author, and editor. She got her start in cannabis media as a student journalist, that too, at San Francisco State University in 2007, then became the editorial assistant to Ed Rosenthal. You poor thing. For just over 10 years, she's been the editor of multiple magazines and online publications and has edited cultivation, science, research, medical, and cultural cannabis books. She earned her MBA at Mills College in Oakland, California, while covering the Prop 19 legalization campaign back in 2010, and specializes in long-form investigative reporting on the economics of legalization. Tauhid Chappell is an 8-year veteran of the media industry with a resume that includes stints at the Washington Post and the Philadelphia Inquirer. Tauhid is also an executive board member and parliamentarian of the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists, the oldest association of black journalists in the country, and the chapter responsible for founding the National Association of Black Journalists. Through PABJ, he launched 2 cannabis conferences, the Color of Cannabis and the Can Atlantic Conference, both of which focused on media, equity, and policy in the cannabis space. Next up, we have Kymone Freeman. Kymone is an artist, activist, and co-founder of We Act Radio, Washington, D.C.'s independent progressive radio and TV studio. Most recently, in memory of slain community journalists, We Act Radio established the Charnice Milton Community Bookstore. Freeman is also an award-winning playwright with several productions to his credit. His most recent stage production, The Night Michael Jackson Died, was the first theatrical performance ever held at the Hamilton Live in downtown D.C., and appeared in New York City at the historic SOBs. Vanessa Maria Graber is a community organizer, media personality, and educator from Philadelphia. She's currently the News Voices at New Jersey manager at Free Press, where she works with journalists and community leaders on meeting the public's information needs during the pandemic. Most recently, she was the station manager and co-founder of the community radio station WPPM-FM at Philly Cam, where she still hosts several radio TV programs. By the way, full disclosure, one of my shows airs on WPPM, including the People Power Lunch Hour, a program featuring organizers with local social movements, and East Coast Cannabis Radio, a program about cannabis culture and drug policy. Vanessa has over 20 years experience in media and grassroots campaigns. She's worked on media justice issues, such as the largest U.S. expansion of community radio, reforming net neutrality rules, and advocating for public access TV. In addition to media policy, Vanessa's been organizing locally for drug policy reform, including working to pass the cannabis decrim law in Philadelphia, advocating for Senate Bill 7 for medical cannabis in Pennsylvania, organizing to expand the medical cannabis program in New Jersey, and coordinating events in support of cannabis legalization in Philly and New Jersey. She currently works with a coalition of people of color in Philadelphia to legalize cannabis in Pennsylvania and repair the damage done to communities of color by the drug war. And last but certainly not least, I bring up our moderator for this panel, and that is Steve Bloom. Steve is one of my very best friends and my editor. Again, in full disclosure, I've been working with Steve for several years and have written for him on several publications. Steve is a longtime journalist and author with 32 years in the cannabis community. His credits include editor-in-chief of 2 Centennial Media titles, Marijuana Goes Mainstream and The Complete Guide to CBD, publisher of CelebStoner.com, one of the leading sources of marijuana and celebrity news on the web since 2007, former editor of High Times magazine from 1988 to 2007, back when they were good, and producer of the Stony and Doobie Award shows, and the 2 Hempilation benefit albums for Normal back in 95 and 98, while at High Times. former editor-in-chief of Freedom Leaf magazine and freedomleaf.com from 2014 to 2019, co-author of Pot Culture, the A to Z Guide to Stoner Language and Life, and Reefer Movie Madness, the Ultimate Stoner Film Guide, along with Shirley Halperin. Recipient of Normal's Media and Culture Award in 2004, Cannabis MVP by the Cannabis Business Awards in 2018, New York Normal Activism Award in 2019. He's appeared as a moderator, panelist, and speaker at many marijuana reform conferences, or events rather, including the Normal Conference, the Drug Policy Alliance Conference, International Cannabis Business Conference, Cannabis Media Summit, Seattle Hempfest, Boston Freedom Rally, Cypress Hill Smokeout, the New York City Cannabis Parade and Rally, and a lot more. He's a board member and co-organizer of the annual NYC Cannabis Parade and Rally. He's a founder and organizer of the Teapot Party with Willie Nelson, a founder and commissioner, most important, founder and commissioner of the New York Media Softball League since 2007. And, oh yeah, and he wrote this book in '82 that I have a signed copy of, an autographed copy of, called Video Invaders, which was just brilliant. Told you if you sent me your bios, I'd by God read them, and I did. And before any ado can possibly be furthered, I'm going to get out of the way, shut up, and turn this over to my good friend Steve Bloom. All of you are good friends. All of you are brilliant people. I love you all, and I am so grateful to you for being here with us today.
Right, Doug. Thank you, Doug, for that terrific introduction. I'm flattered. I'm very excited to be here today, to be part of the Seattle Hempfest that is not taking place live. Normally takes place in August. A beautiful location along the Puget Sound up in Seattle. Obviously, this year was postponed, and they've decided to put together a program that you're watching today and will watch for the next couple of days. A variety of panel discussions. What's popular at the Hempfest, if anybody in our group has been there, is the Hemposium Stage. There are 7 or 8 stages in the park, and you wander around listening to mostly bands, but there's this separate stage where it's a closed-in tent where people can go and listen to people speak about various issues. And kind of what we're doing now is the virtual Hemposium. So I'm very excited to be part of that. I've been to Seattle Hempfest several times. I have not been there in many years, but now I'm back with Seattle Hempfest. So I'm very excited to be part of this today. My background, as Doug said, goes 30 years plus in cannabis journalism. Prior to that, I was an entertainment journalist. I started as a music journalist in the late 70s and worked my way around the publishing industry, in and out of jobs, freelancing, editing, learning my way through the publishing industry in New York, and then luckily getting a job at High Times in the late 80s, 1988. I had a friend who worked up there, invited me to be news editor of High Times, and that started my journey in cannabis. I'm a longtime smoker, go back to high school, but I really wasn't an activist till I got involved at High Times. I didn't go to rallies, didn't go to parades. In New York, it was decriminalized, so I guess we really weren't fighting a big fight. And it was pretty laid back in the 70s in New York. The rest were very low, so there really wasn't the issues that we've been facing for the last 15 or 20 years. Back then, it wasn't as bad as has become today in terms of the drug war and New York hit a point of 50,000 arrests a year. And I just documented at Celeb Stoner, my website, that there have been over 7 million marijuana arrests made in America in the last 10 years. Even though arrests are going down, it's just been a staggering number of people been arrested for cannabis. And of course, a vast majority of people of color being arrested for cannabis. So with that little background, I've moved around. I worked to High Times. I worked for Freedom Leaf. I'm working for other publications now. My main focus these days is Celeb Stoner. But I want to get things going, so less about me and more about everybody else. I'm going to start with someone I know who lives in Philadelphia, Vanessa Maria. Vanessa's been to New York several times to attend the New York City Cannabis Parade and Rally, which I'm involved with, and I've seen her there several times. I follow her very closely on Facebook. If you want to know anything about what's going on in Philadelphia, just check out Vanessa Maria's feed. So Vanessa, I basically would like everybody to sort of kind of just go around the horn here and just tell everybody what you've been up to lately and how have you been dealing with COVID? What has your life been like for the last 6 months?
Thanks for the opportunity to be here, and it's great to share with all of you. Um, Most recently, I joined the staff of Free Press, and I've been doing a lot of work with journalists in New Jersey and community members, along with my colleague Tauhid, who's doing that work in Philly, and just doing a lot of listening, right? Like it's almost like a listening tour of what people need. My work focus is specifically on meeting the public's information needs during the pandemic. So that gives me a lot of insight on what people are experiencing directly, especially in places like New Jersey, northern New Jersey, especially. It was hit really bad with the pandemic. At one point, New York and North Jersey were the epicenter. And so what I've been discovering is that people are living under pretty bad conditions, especially communities of color who have been disproportionately affected by COVID. And that's been exacerbated by the existing conditions of poverty that we are experiencing here in Philadelphia and in other big cities like New York, Chicago, LA, etc. So I work on many different things. Of course, I produce a show called People Power Lunch Hour that's all about social movements. So I cover local organizing campaigns that have been happening. That for about 20 years, I've been covering protests, starting with the anti-war protests in the early 2000s. Most recently, I've been covering the uprisings happening in Philly. So when things were on fire, you burned police cars, the Starbucks, like I was right there filming, inhaling the fumes and seeing the chaos unfold. There's been continued organizing with the Movement for Black Lives and Philadelphia Coalition for Real Justice in terms of calling for police and prison abolition. So I've done media around that as well. I've also been covering a homeless encampment. There's actually 3 homeless encampments in Philadelphia, which of course is a result of the crisis and lack of affordable housing, which of course many cities across America can relate, and trying to understand more what solutions are on the table for getting people into affordable housing. Of course, you might have seen a huge victory in Philadelphia this week. The city announced that it would be giving 50 vacant homes to the housing rights organizers. So that's really exciting, and activists across the United States have been commenting on that. So it's always exciting to be in Philly. There's always a lot of activism and people pushing hard for different things. I'm also involved, you see my little flag back here, I'm Puerto Rican, and I've been trying to get out the vote here in Philly with the Latinx community. There isn't a lot of engagement with voters in North Philadelphia who are mostly Black and Latino and also, experiencing poverty. So I've been working with a team, Philly Boricuas, and we've been going out into the neighborhoods, which, is just something we felt we had to do despite it being the pandemic. There is still a lot of fear and precaution. So a lot of the voter outreach you see is done over the phone and through text message and social media. But we know there's a huge digital divide. So that's why we have been going to parks and community centers. So tomorrow we'll be at a Latino supermarket doing a big event there, trying to explain to people how to get mail-in ballots. As you know, Pennsylvania is a battleground state, and there's a huge number of new Latinos to Philadelphia as a result of the earthquakes and hurricane disasters in Puerto Rico resulting from the climate crisis. So I've been pretty busy. I also joined the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, and my brother from another mother, Tauhid, is working on his end with PABJ. And we're trying to shift coverage on a number of different things. Of course, Latinos have their own set of needs. We would like more Spanish language information. And when it comes to like the Spanish language media, like Telemundo, Univision, and how they cover cannabis, there's still a lot of work to be done. And if you look at the state level on a public health communications perspective, Latinos still can't really access medical marijuana in Pennsylvania. And so there's a lot of outreach and communication that needs to be done to be able to get the information to my community. The way that all this stuff intersects is like, at a very basic level, like access to communication, information is a human right. We need information that's accurate, that's reflective of our communities to be able to be more engaged and active, right? And hopefully people who are more informed and civically engaged can contribute to their own liberation. So that's why I do the work that I do. I have to consume a lot of cannabis in order to deal with all of this. So it has definitely both fueled my advocacy and helped treat my anxiety. But never a boring day here in Philadelphia on the front lines. And so I will keep you posted. You can follow me at NewsDrawn or on Facebook, as you said, and see my daily dispatches and rants about all things happening in Philly.
Well, one follow-up question for you. Anything to say to our president who had that comment recently about bad things happen in Philadelphia?
Well, bad things happen in the White House too, apparently, and on Air Force One. Yeah. I would actually, people in Philly said, yeah, it's true, right? Like we have, they're the biggest poor city in the country. We have a rising rate of gun violence. We have schools that are falling apart and underfunded. We have roads and dilapidated homes that need repaired. Our federal funding continues to be cut for vital social programs. Yes, bad things are happening as a result of your bad policies and the way that you have disavowed people of color and poor and working people. So we need to do something about that. It's what he's saying is not true, but good things happen in Philadelphia too, because people are fighting back, they're organizing, they're informing themselves, they're mobilizing people. And hopefully when we get out the vote, we'll see some better things happening in terms of like changing the people who are in power.
Thanks for that. Tauhid, you live in Philadelphia as well, Tauhid?
I technically now live in South Jersey outside of Philadelphia, but my work for Free Press with my colleague Vanessa is focused and emphasized in Philadelphia. I used to live in Philadelphia for 2 years.
Would you like to weigh in on that question about Trump's comment?
Oh, well, first and foremost, thank you for having me be a part of this. And I'm just, happy to be on this prestigious panel with so many people, including a person like Vanessa, who I consider a mentor of mine. So to even share this space with her is a huge honor. But, in terms of comments on Trump, like, he says what he says just to get people stirred up. We have bigger issues that we need to focus on. So for him to call out Philadelphia is nothing new. We kind of have an understanding of what Philly feels like against Trump. So, for me to see that comment, it is what it is. You see a whole lot of t-shirts happening, which is, expected to see people really rally around the Philadelphia pride. But, I'm not too worried about his emphasis on our city. We have a whole lot of things that we need to focus on. So if people want to help out with all the issues that Vanessa brought up with Philly, we can certainly use that support. So I'm glad he said it out, because now people are looking at Philly and hopefully some of the resources will come to our communities.
Okay, so fill me in on what have you been up to over the last 6 months, and what kind of work are you doing right now?
Yeah, so like Vanessa, I also joined Free Press, which is a media policy and media advocacy organization. My focus specifically is on a long-term project in Philadelphia focused on basically transforming and reimagining how journalists cover crime, police, public safety, and the criminal legal system. And it's a twofold type of project. It's one, working with journalists to make sure that they are centering and elevating the perspectives and expertise of people impacted by policing in the criminal legal system, mostly Black and Brown and disproportionately Black and Brown communities, and also working with community organizers, community activists, and community members to feel empowered to tell their stories, tell their narratives, and get the information that is vital for them to understand and navigate these complex systems that are very suppressive and oppressive. And as we know, historically, media has never been reflective of these communities. So we are building an information structure and information tree that really accurately and adequately addresses this information when the local news media ecosystem isn't doing a sufficient job in informing us. So it's a really cool project. It's a really good way to really think about the shortfalls that local media and commercial media typically has, in trying to find best ways to keep us all informed so that we can be more civically and politically engaged to transform these institutions. So I've been busy working on that front in Philadelphia. I also just launched this past Saturday the Can-Atlantic Conference, which was referenced, which was the country's first Mid-Atlantic cannabis conference virtually, focused on equity, media, and policy for those who were inside and outside and just interested in the cannabis space. So that was a long-term project that I had been working on since last year. We were supposed to launch in April of this year. Obviously, COVID threw a wrench in that, so we pushed that into a digital format later in September, and we finally launched. So if you're interested in learning about the Mid-Atlantic cannabis markets, check out Can-Atlantic Conference. We had an awesome amount of different organizers and organizations on the ground in the region talking about their state cannabis markets and what legalization might look like moving forward. And we know that New Jersey is going to legalize, or most likely will legalize in November. What does that mean for the rest of the region? How is that domino effect going to impact this region that has a lot of Black and brown communities? And specifically with a city like Philadelphia, which is a 44% Black population, and a city like Vanessa mentioned has a 25% poverty rate, what does legalization mean in Pennsylvania, and how can that potentially impact our communities here? So that just got launched off the ground, and I'm very excited to continue that conversation too. I'm also a cannabis patient. I suffer from an autoimmune deficiency disorder called ulcerative colitis. And for those who might have not heard about that, but may know or have heard of Crohn's disease, it's within that similar family. So it's been really scary. It's been really scary for me to see this pandemic just go out of control and have our leadership at all levels fail in addressing and adequately addressing these issues. As a Black disabled man, I don't have the certain privileges that a lot of people still take for granted, and it's kind of hard to see, people that I know within my network be able to go out, socialize with or without masks. And I think there needs to be a lot more emphasis on the disability community and the things that we have access to and the things that we don't have access to. So it's been really difficult seeing that because, I do want to be outside. I do want to participate in rallies. I have to figure out my own space and my own ability to contribute to some of these causes, like getting people out to vote, like talking about cannabis and rallying around cannabis legalization and reparations in the cannabis space. But I have to do it from a very particular position because I can't expose myself. I'm part of that bucket of, if I get COVID, I'm not good to anybody if I'm dead. So I have to be really, really cautious about my health. And I think that puts a really different perspective in how I operate in this pandemic, because I just don't have those luxuries. Even going out to do a grocery run is dangerous for me. Even going out and walking on a trail, even if there's a lot of people that are spaced out, that's still a danger to me because I don't have an immune system. I have a compromised and a suppressed immune system. A lot of this has really altered my way of navigating in this world, and has put a lot of stress on me too. So shout out to Vanessa also saying I consume a lot of cannabis to help with my anxiety as well, and to keep my stress levels low, because if I stress too much, I will have a trigger. And if I trigger, I'm going to have a flare up and I might end up in the hospital. And that's the last thing that I want to be doing right now as a patient. So it's been an interesting couple of months. The shift from relocating from Philly into my grandparents' house for the time being has been nice. It's been nice to be able to at least walk around and experience a little bit of fresh air, where you're not living into, kind of condensed and consolidated spaces like in cities. So it has been a little bit of a positive impact. And I've been just trying to find the silver lining to all of this. I think there are definitely silver linings that people can find that can help, improve our mental health, or at least keep us a little bit stable during this time. But, I would be lying if I said it was an easy shift. This has all been really difficult for everybody. So to everyone who's kind of like, also in the same boat of feeling anxious, feeling like you're not doing enough, feeling like, like you should be doing more, take time for yourself. This is the time for you to really focus on your health, focus on your mental health, especially, and just know that, you're not alone in this. You're not alone in your anxiety. You're not alone in your fear. And by connecting with people, hopefully we can make this all out together. So.
Hey, thanks so much for that in-depth answer. I'm going to switch to Angela, and you'll notice that even though this is Seattle Hempfest, this is a very East Coast dominated panel, and we have one representative of the West Coast, and it's Angela Bacca. Angela, you live in Santa Barbara?
Near Santa Barbara, yeah.
Near Santa
City of
Barbara.
Lompoc.
Okay, so Angela has been involved, as Doug said, in the cannabis community for years. As she worked, I first met you, and when you were working with Ed Rosenthal. You've gone on to be a really strong cannabis journalist. And one of the things you're famous for is your long form articles. I mean, articles that really are in depth, multi-part articles that go on, it's a commitment to read. Really, really good work, good research. So tell us what you've been up to lately and what's life like in California.
Life has been pretty rough in California lately. We haven't had a lot of clean air to breathe, and we just got some in the last couple days and lost it again because of new fires. So you can't see it as well right now, but the sky is kind of orange here. I'm down in the city of Lompoc, which is 2 hours north of Los Angeles, and I grew up in this town, although I'm from South LA originally. It's always been kind of a sad little town with a sad, slow economy. After Prop 64 passed in California, we became one of the only cities in California to license a complete free market. So we added pretty much no rules over the state, no tax over the state, and everything goes, including social consumption lounges. So this tiny little town has actually gotten 50 to 60 new businesses in the last year, and even with the COVID recession, we're padding our budgets pretty heavily. We have 16 dispensaries in a town with 43,000 people. So we have more than most states per capita here right now, probably most of these East Coast states we're talking about. And on that note, that's where a lot of my focus has been on the markets. Coming from the West Coast and coming from that early medical market, I saw how a completely unregulated market for commercial cannabis led to a diversity of product, a diversity of genetics in the cannabis itself, and a diversity of people who are involved in that. And because of that, we've had crazy innovations and so many great genetics and so many great growing methods coming out of the West Coast. What we've seen is as everybody in the country watched that happen on the West Coast and wanted the same thing, it was kind of preempted once it got east of the Rockies. Almost all of the states out there ended up with these literal cartel markets where the government would restrict just a small amount of licenses to serve the entire market. I know in New York, I think you started with 10. We have more than that in my tiny little town here in Southern California right now. So a lot of my focus has been on the economics of this and how it does or doesn't actually achieve the goals of legalization that we have set out for when we do this. When we talk about social equity in licensing, you can't band-aid a program that was designed as a cartel for very wealthy people by giving one license away to one person who represents an equity diversity. You need to bring down the barriers to entry of the market and allow people to have small business ownership again, like they did in the early West Coast markets, which are also being consolidated ahead of federal legalization with the state-federal conflict and the way our oversupply has been handled within California and Oregon. What we need to see happen is the federal government to step down and decriminalize and deschedule, and we need to see free markets encouraged in more places. I would say the best example of this right now is Oklahoma, where you see more community ownership than any other part of this country, including the West or the East Coast. So for me, what I've been working on, over the last 10 years, I've traveled all over the country. I've lived in various different places. I was in the Bay Area for 10 years. I was in Utah for 1.5 years, where I worked on their medical cannabis bill and then also covered that state from a block away from the capital, becoming the first state in the country to become a CBD-only state. And what happened behind the scenes in that state before things then followed all the rest of the country, Florida setting up their CBD cartel. From there, I was also able to be in Colorado as legalization was rolling out there, and Nevada and Oregon and a few other places. In 2015, the day cannabis became legal in Oregon, I moved to Portland, Oregon, and I was there for the last 4 years before I came back home to celebrate what happened in my own hometown. And so I've had a pretty diverse view of how these markets have been shaped in different places. I've spent a lot of time reporting in Arkansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Florida, and a handful of other kind of conservative states where it's really restrictive. And because of this, I've been working for the last 2.5 years, and I'm getting close to being able to put together a book that looks at the last 10 years of the Green Rush and how all of these different state markets rolling out were actually kind of connected and not completely separate. And the point of it was to create a consolidated market that looks more like everything else we see in big agriculture or big business or highly restricted markets like tobacco and alcohol. Other than that, I've been working on editing and managing the new revised version of Ed Rosenthal's Marijuana Growers Handbook. So between those two books and the fact that I, like Tauhid, also have Crohn's disease, have been pretty much in lockdown here. And that's worked out pretty well for me because I'm working on 2 books at the moment. But I totally hear what you're saying about what's going on in the streets right now, because for the last 10, 15 years, especially in the Bay Area, I was always down there seeing these things firsthand and understanding what's actually happening on the ground and not what's happening on CNN or even your local media coverage. And so being someone with a compromised immune system, it's such a weird time to have to see everything from inside a bubble instead of being able to do that. So whatever we can do to support the reporters who are actually able to be out there right now is where I think we should all focus. I'll step back on that.
Thanks a lot, Angela. Appreciate that. We're just going to come back to the East Coast now, and we're going to talk to Kymone Freeman, who lives in DC. So Kymone, tell us what you've been up to over the last 6 months or so, COVID period, and what's going on in your career.
You have to unmute. Yep. Unmute.
All right. Sorry about that. I'm just thrilled. I'm one of those people that's just excited about this special period that we're in. Let me share a quote with you from Milton Friedman, who was not a friend of the progressives, no part, but even a broke clock is right twice a day. He went on to say, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are laying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. I have been working diligently to develop alternatives to existing policies during this time, because I think the COVID-19 crisis has exposed all the fault lines in America's system, from healthcare to criminal justice, is all on display. And so we at Radio, as an independent outlet in DC, audience has expanded tremendously during this period. We're doing exceptionally well. I can't dance in the end zone because so many people are not able to say that. We was there June 1st when Bill Barr sicked his goons on peaceful protesters. We covered that. Most of the footage that was seen from that is our footage. It was, everyone from the Washington Post to 60 Minutes aired our footage. We had millions of views. And so we're excited to be a part of supporting the Black Lives Matter movement for justice in these cases. And then on top of that, the impending housing crisis. We have hosted solutions to the housing crisis because in DC and in many cities across America, a third of the renters are behind in their rent. Some people are behind in their mortgage. And we're about to see capitalism put on trial if we don't have, if they don't embrace, alternatives to existing policies to see that canceling rent is going to be necessary to prevent massive evictions in this country. I'd like to see what would happen if this country says to you that they cannot afford to cancel rent for a third of the country, but they can't afford to evict a third of the country. In the midst of a pandemic, during a contested election, we would see chaos at a level we have not seen before. I think this country is now finally on trial, and we are in the midst of a revolution. Martin Luther King said, remaining awake during a great revolution. And that's where we are. And then the opportunity to be with you guys here today is thrilling as well, because journalism is the second draft of history. And even with the decriminalization or the legalization of weed in over 20 states, including District of Columbia, who is not a state, taxation by representation is very real here. But the harmful stereotypes in marijuana consumers, about marijuana consumers, still persists. Just recently I was in a gun store and I saw a sign that says, you're not allowed to purchase a gun in the state of Maryland if you have a medical marijuana card. You know, so you lose your Second Amendment right by exercising the renewed ability to possess marijuana legally. So this is where we are. America is in a unique space right now, and I think all of the hypocrisies of our legal system is being brought to bear. And so it's exciting to see it being examined and re-examined and hopefully challenged and overcome.
Thank you so much. So we have about 25 minutes to go, and I just want to let people know that the topics I want to focus on at this point is activism and diversity in the media. And then if we have some time, we could talk about how we all try to make a living. With the topic of activism, you know, as an editor at High Times, I learned to be an activist journalist. That was not what I did previous to that. I might have had my opinion of a review that I was writing about an album, you know, okay, that was my opinion. But, you know, when you're reporting and you're covering, you usually, you know, say cover both sides. You try to be objective. But once I worked at High Times, I learned that that wasn't the objective. You know, we were trying to change the laws, and it wasn't our job to go give the DEA its point of view. You know, people get that elsewhere. So I just wanted to have a discussion here about activism within the media, how you wear both hats. And I'd like to start with Vanessa on that, an activist in Philadelphia who's on the media side. How do you wear both hats and provide the information you need to provide?
Yeah, I'm with you. I was always an activist and a journalist. And then at a certain point, I became an activist journalist. And now I'm an activist for media. So it's kind of like they're all intertwined. But, well, the first thing is, and I'll go back to like, you know, the history is like, I noticed that when I was going to anti-war protests, like there are really big ones in New York City and Washington, D.C., and it was before social media and smartphones. And so, you know, people just didn't know that there was this big anti-war movement, right? And I remember going back to my college campus and people literally didn't believe me. And I was like, wait till I develop my film and bring it back. I'll show you. But then, you know, my pictures didn't do it justice. And when I searched for news coverage about the anti-war protests, and it was like a global day of action, right? There was protests all over the country. There was no mention of it. I searched far and wide, and CNN had like maybe like a blip, like, oh, there was some anti-war protests today. And so that told me like the media is complicit, right, in suppressing the voice of the anti-war movement. And not only are they suppressing the voice of the opposition, but they're putting forth misinformation and lies about weapons of mass destruction, about ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and causing Islamophobia, right, within our communities. So for me, that was like the first awakening I had as a young person in the media. At the time, I also started working for Clear Channel Radio, and Clear Channel put out a list of over 100 banned songs, right? We couldn't play them on the radio. So that was another example of censorship, right? And a deliberate effort to not share songs that they thought might be triggering. I mean, one of the songs was Imagine by, by John Lennon, right? So again, you have to question these things when you're in these spaces. And that led me to get into more like academia, activism, and community radio. And what I learned in the community radio movement, again, is more information and education about the effects of media consolidation, right? Like what happens when just a few big corporations owns the media, and what happens when our newsrooms are dominated by older white males, right? And when these newspapers and TV stations don't include everybody, right? So there's a lot of people excluded from the media, they're underrepresented. What happens to the narratives? And then when you ask people about their primary sources of news and information, it's still TV, radio, online sources. Now it's increasingly social media, that there's a direct line between, right, like the big media companies and the agenda that they set and what people ultimately believe about policies, government, racism, COVID-19, etc. So that led me down the path of thinking about other ways that we can interrupt those narratives, right? So there's pirate radios in there too, right? Which has been used all around the world to disrupt oppressive government-controlled media. Alternative media, magazines, zines, right? Philadelphia has a huge history of distributing little paper zines, public access television, right? So there's a myriad of alternative news media out there who are putting forth counter narratives to what the mainstream media is doing. So, you know, one of the experiences that really shaped my life is I did research in Bosnia and Croatia with journalists who were studying from, were benefiting from USAID media development programs. And they said, we don't buy into Western ideas of objectivity. How can you portray both sides when the other side disappeared 9 members of your family? And so many of the journalists I talked to had experienced loss at the hands of you know, either Bosnian Serbs or Croats. You know, everybody had experienced some type of loss. How can you then report both sides and be fair? Like we have a bias, right? Inherently. What we do is we try to seek the truth, and we try to find facts, and we try to talk to as many people as possible. So this is another way of doing journalism that wasn't being put forth in journalism schools and being practiced in newsrooms. With that idea in mind, you know, again, I see myself in the same way as a truth teller, right? Trying to be accurate, trying to talk to as many people as possible, trying to really understand an issue and be engaged with my community. And if I have a bias, I say, yes, I'm a Latina woman born and raised in Philly, and this is who's telling you this story. But I think that, you know, there's still this like clinging on to this idea of objectivity, which to me only serves to uphold the status quo in systems of white supremacy and capitalism. So, you know, again, when people say, well, you're an activist journalist, I said, well, I cover activism. I fight for more access to media and media reform, but really I'm a truth teller. That's what I do, tell the truth. And try to be fair to the people most negatively impacted by a particular issue. And so I think that's what needs to happen is we need to stop relying on city government sources and academics, and we need to start talking to more people in the community that know. I don't think people can be objective. If you are experiencing racism and microaggressions on a daily basis, that impacts your objectivity. If you are someone that is doing that to other people and benefiting from these systems, you too have a bias. So I think that, you know, the direction that we're advocating for, right? Like there is a thing called movement journalism, right? Where it is journalism and media that is kind of an extension or wing of a movement, right? In trying to advocate for change. But I also think that within existing and traditional newsrooms, we need to break away from this idea of activist journalism and move in the direction of verification, transparency in your own biases, and seeking the truth no matter what the cost.
Terrific answer. Thank you so much. So Kymone, can you weigh in on this? What is the role of activism in media?
Well, first, I wanted to say that Fox News is the largest news organization in America, and they have zero objectivity. And when they was in Australia, I believe, they was actually described as being a cancer to democracy. I just want to put that out there because that is where we are. The best way I can answer your question is to point to here in DC, there was a 1,000-square-foot art installation depicting the suffragist and civil rights advocate Ida B. Wells for the 19th Amendment anniversary. There was a portrait, it was a collage portrait with 5,000 historic black and white photographs from women from the suffrage movement. And that is, if you report that, that is accurate. All of that is true. But that also leaves out the fact that Ida B. Wells was a journalist who spoke out against lynching. That was her raison d'etre. And to this day, America has no federal laws against lynching. Okay, they have it against destroying a statue, but not for destroying Black bodies. And she went on to say, and this quote sits on the front door of WEAC Radio studio. She says that those that commit the murders write the reports. Now that all of that is left out in her being honored as part of the women's suffragist movement. So when WEAC Radio reported it, we made sure that we mentioned all of that. So what my point is, even when they get the story right, the omission and what they're not saying is just as important as what has been said. And I think that it is imperative that we, as independent, if we're going to be independent, we should be outside the box. I loved your publication, and they so many great articles came out of that that would never been printed in mainstream publications. And I'm sure there's been times where they might have picked up on a story that you guys broke first. I know here in DC, many NPR, WAMU, Washington Post even will mine smaller outlets for information and news stories that he otherwise would never have picked up on. If it gets a little traction, it makes a little noise, they pick it up, and I could point to several instances of that happening. I make no apologies about being an activist journalist. I think it's imperative. I think it's the times that we're living in. And if we, I don't think there's good people on both sides. I don't carry that Trump line of reasoning. You know what I'm saying? So I don't even waste my time with trying to humanize or sympathize or empathize with the opposition. You know, it's like, well, you got to have it so that the Republicans' point of view is made. I don't care about, it's 2 points. It's a right one and a wrong one. And I like to think that we're on the right side of history. And I think that if Fox News is the #1 news agency in this country, then we need to do what we can to offset that.
Thanks a lot. Angela, do you consider yourself an activist journalist?
I don't know how I could not consider myself an activist journalist because of the way I came into the industry. I think or into the media generally, the first articles I was writing were activist pieces about mothers getting their children taken away for their cannabis use, and with a clear appeal at the end that says, if you want to help, here's how you help. But to echo what Vanessa and Kymone just said, I don't think it's possible at all for there ever to not be a bias when covering cannabis, because you're either giving equal weight to people's opinions or you're going to go with the facts. And the facts aren't commonly accepted by the majority of people just yet. So we have a lot of that to combat when you're covering cannabis in particular. But I also think we need to get away from this idea that there is such a thing as non-biased media, period. There just is not. We're all humans. We're the ones who report it. And I think that as a journalist myself, I can have my activist bent. I can have my own opinions. But if I'm citing my sources for the facts that I'm claiming to have, and I'm clearly disclosing my biases by giving you those opinions up front, to me, that's almost more honest of a reporting style than to pretend that I have no bias in this and give equal weight to people's opinions. If you're a really good journalist and you did your research, you will have an opinion about what you're working on.
Thanks a lot. So I want to steer towards the next question. We only have that much time left, but this one could eat up the rest of our allotted time. So directed at Tauhid, who founded the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists. And so I want to zero in on diversity in cannabis as far as the media is concerned. Where are we in that place? Is there enough work for people of color, or are people of color being left behind?
Thanks, Steve, for that question. One slight correction. I'm an executive board member. PABJ was founded in 1973, I believe. So I was not a founder, but I would have loved to have been there in that room when it created. But I carry that legacy of working to ensure that there is more diversity and equity and inclusion in the media space. But to answer your point, no, there is absolutely not enough diversity. There is not enough representation. And frankly, in commercial media and nonprofit media, there will never be diversity of the proportions that it needs to be at, because the way that commercial media is structured is inherently suppressing and oppressing and censoring journalists of color who work in that industry and work in that sector. It's very hard. I've worked 4 years in local TV, 2 years in Phoenix, 2 years in Sacramento. I worked at the Washington Post. I've worked at the Philadelphia Inquirer. So 2 different newspapers. I've worked in 2 different types of sectors of the media industry, and it gets no better. It's not easy for Black journalists and journalists of color to talk about their ideas, raise issues that come from their communities and their networks, because inherently the structure is very white-centered. It's very much focused on white issues, and the people who are in charge with determining the newsworthiness of what the media or what the public gets to see and consume are inherently white, and they do not really value or understand or really appreciate the complexities, the context and the nuance that affect and impact communities of color. And so we have a long ways to go. I mean, there are surveys, there are reports out there to show that there is consistent failure of representation in mainstream media. And that's why you do see, and that's why there has always historically have been newspapers and other media that have been created by Black people, by communities of color, because they feel left out. They don't feel reflected. They don't feel represented within the media ecosystem. And that is so true. I've experienced it for almost 10 years working with the newspapers and TV, that there is there's a pipeline issue. There's a retention issue. There's a equity and payment issue. There's all sorts of issues that really inhibit commercial media from actually transforming and being reflective of the communities that it should be covering. And I have to mention this because I mentioned this to everybody, is that I think the Census Bureau predicted by 2050, there's gonna be more people of color than white people. And that's going to have to be there's gonna have to be a fundamental shift in power dynamics and power structures and structures of this entire industry if we're actually gonna be truly reflective of the changing demographics of our country. And that has historically never been the case. And, for me, I see that the increase of work that we see from people who are working as, independent journalists, or sometimes called freelance journalists, or independent contractors, we're seeing a larger creation of that, because people are understanding that these newsrooms are toxic places. These newsrooms make it very difficult for us to work in, because we have to go through all these microaggressions, racism, all these types of dismissals about what we know is the truth about our communities, but we know is not being reported within these institutions. So there's going to be, in my opinion, especially given the fact that the pandemic has continued to shrink the industry as we see it, we're going to see a lot more people just venturing out on their own, creating new ecosystems, creating new information trees, and really addressing and providing better alternatives to what we're seeing right now in the mainstream sector.
Thanks a lot for that. Vanessa, where can people of color, where can they turn to in the media to find coverage of for people of color? Where's the vibe for cannabis?
Well, of course, community radio, right? Like that's where my heart is. When I started WPPM, I was like, we need shows about cannabis, the drug war, drug policy. So of course I put Century of Lies on there, and Cultural Baggage, the Drug Truth Network. We had our own show. I think community radio has been one of the longest standing places that have invited discussion, conversation about cannabis, right, and the drug war, and been able to have long conversations. When I had my office at WPPM, I always had the radio on, and I always appreciated the coverage from the conferences, because those were conferences I couldn't afford, right, or couldn't travel to, right? So being able to record those sessions, talk to the experts, and learn, I learned so much just by listening to those shows. So, and I'm not just, kissing butt here. Shout out to KMUD, right, KMUD, in Northern California, which is another station. Sometimes they call it KBUD. Because they have a whole marijuana news report, and I remember they would let people know on the radio if the police were around or the feds were around doing raids, and they were really a vital resource during the wildfires. So like I said, community radio stations, public access TV, also they've all had people locally contribute content around those issues. KBOO in Portland as well has been another great station. So I could go on, but that's my shout out to community media. There's a lot of really great podcasts too. The podcast scene is emerging, and you can find a number of really great POC podcasts. And my former co-host, Flip Marley, started a whole venture called Black Cannabis. That's a multimedia platform. In Philly, we had Black Cannabis Week, right, which is information and education in the form of a digital space of organizing and workshops. So I'm always been an audio visual person. There's a lot of really great individuals, I would say, that work for publications that do online stuff. We haven't really seen a mainstream like High Times like magazine or media outlet geared towards people of color, but certainly the information is out there. If you look for podcasts on iTunes or sites like Spotify, you'll find a myriad of producers, but also check out the Drug Truth Network for some really basic information. And I hope that people will continue creating content, right, at the local level, at the national level, but we're still not really there. When I look for Spanish language sources, I'm always finding things produced in other countries, right, from Mexico and Colombia. There's been a lot of really great media and publications. Puerto Rico now has a cannabis scene with medical marijuana. And there's going to be a conference in December that we're putting on in collaboration, or it's being led by the Minority Cannabis Business Administration, which is the Asamblea Internacional Cannabica, which is like International Cannabis Assembly. So one of the things that we're trying to do is find more media, like who are they? Let's aggregate them. Let's try to put them all on one page as a resource, and let's form a network so we can work together.
That's great. Thanks a lot. I'd really love to extend this conversation on diversity, but we don't have too much time left. So I'm going to steer off in one other direction. It's sort of like a nuts and bolts question that I have, that when I do media panels, I'm always curious how people are doing. How are they making their living? It's tough out there in the cannabis community. As a website publisher, there's not a lot of revenues coming in. I just started a Patreon account because I'm trying to raise some revenues. Curious how everybody's doing. Angela, how are you doing?
I've never fully relied on article publications for my income. I've always been editing a book on the side. I've done a lot of book editing for doctors and some researchers, and right now Ed Rosenthal's the cultivation content. And so I'm doing fine because this lockdown has really helped work on books. But I've definitely always taken on book projects and then small side consulting projects for people trying to get involved in the industry. And almost all the time that's volunteer. So.
Kymone, how does it work for you doing a radio program, and how are revenues for you?
Well, as I said before, we're doing exceptionally well in this time period because so many things are virtual. As a full service media production company, our revenue has gone up because we're covering virtual conferences that otherwise would not have happened. In the traditional sense, they wouldn't have had live streaming. They wouldn't have had a need for Zoom management and things of that nature. So our revenue streams has gone up because of that. We're in more demand, and also because of the political climate. We were struggling. We're celebrating our ninth year anniversary, November 11th this year. And the first 5 years was a struggle. It was during the Obama administration, and everyone loved Obama like he was Jesus walking on water, that he couldn't do no wrong. And so us being an activist station during that time period was unpopular. But now everyone hates Trump. And so it has really led to a larger audience for our platform. And so we're having the best of times in the midst of the worst of times. And I'm just grateful that we're here in position to do what we can to amplify the voices of opposition at this time. And because we're always going to remember the silence of our friends. It's not going to be the voices of our enemies. It's going to be the silence of our friends that we're going to remember, and that's Martin King again, because we're on the radical side of Martin King Avenue, so always got to have a MLK quote ready. But I wonder what MLK thought about marijuana. I have researched him tremendously, and he's my shield. I can use the MLK quote for almost any issue you can think of, and the one I'm not able to find is, what was his position on marijuana? And I like to know that one. But I think it's important for me to point out that this is an issue that's near and dear to my heart, because as Doug knows, I started in the drug reform. That was my foray into activism. And so everything that Regulator does is based upon drug reform outreach, because I'm a product of the War on Drugs, people of color in the War on Drugs conferences that educated me years ago, that was in several cities across this nation. And that showed me the intersectionality of all of our issues were addressed in the drug war. And so whenever we start talking about criminal justice, whenever we start talking about decriminalization, whenever we talk about housing, whenever we talking about poverty, all of that is offshoots from the war on drugs. And we need to make sure that we continue to draw those that Venn diagram so that we can address all these issues at once.
Thanks a lot, Kymone. Tauhid, what's your advice to media people out there and how they could make a living and produce revenues?
First and foremost, business 101. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has definitely upended a lot of revenue streams and streams that we were privileged to afford, or at least be able to explore. So if you're looking to become an entrepreneur and understand, how you want to step out on your own, it's never easy. It's not going to be any easier, but really just understand what are the revenue streams? What do contracts look like? Learn about contracts, know contract language, know your worth. Like, honestly, do not undersell yourself. Do not short sell yourself. When you're doing freelance pitches and whatnot, really, really look at your skills and your expertise to bring value to the table. But contracts are critical, because that will really determine how much you're getting paid, when you're getting paid, how are you getting paid. I've been lucky to know a bunch of people, and my partner was also a freelance photographer, to know that so many entities do a really bad job at actually paying people when they're supposed to get paid. So really know your worth, know how to have a strong contract, know when to really escalate things to get your money and get paid for, because a lot of institutions will not pay you on time, or will refuse to pay at the end of the day. So it's incredibly important to understand how contracts work before you decide to step into any sort of freelancing or independent venture. There's a bunch of different cool tools that are now accessible for us to create content and produce content and do things like this. But at the end of the day, if you're looking to get paid for your work, make sure you understand the legalese aspect of what contracts mean, so that you can get paid to your worth.
Thanks for that. And I'm going to finish up, and we're going to say goodbye to Angela, who has to step away. Thank you, Angela, for being with us today. But one last question. I'm going to come back around to the beginning, to Vanessa, who started the program with the first comment. So Vanessa, how are you making a living? How's it working for you?
Well, one of the things I learned from a friend early on is to secure multiple bags, which is have different lines of income, right? Like, don't depend on one source. And that goes back to my days, bartending, catering, working on a food truck, doing freelance work, like doing consulting, doing event planning. So I would offer the same advice to people, is like, try to find multiple lines of income. I think that there's a credible amount of opportunity in using platforms like Anchor FM for podcasting that allows people the ability to incorporate commercials and sponsors very easily. I know a lot of people that are not so smart, that don't produce great content on YouTube, that are making a lot of money. Like, little kids are making money off YouTube. So, and one of the number one podcast is like Joe Rogan's podcast, which I'm not a fan, but Joe Rogan gets millions of hits on YouTube, right? He puts his podcast on YouTube. So he's not only getting income from podcast downloads and Facebook, but he's also getting income from YouTube. So I would say have a social media strategy that is strong, secure all the comms for your brand name, invest in some brand development like logos and a color scheme, get on all the platforms and produce good content, and you will make money.
Well, there you have it. So we're going to wrap this up. It was a terrific panel. I want to thank Vanessa Maria, Angela Bacca, Kymone Freeman, and Tauhid Chappell, and of course, Doug McVeigh for producing this panel and bringing us all together today. Let's hear it for Hempfest, Seattle Hempfest, and let's hope for another 20 years of Hempfest. Thanks for having us and having us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was brilliant. That was brilliant. Yeah. At some point after this thing airs for Hempfest, I should say bye. Thank you all very much. I get my thanks to Tauhid Chappell and Angela Bacca, who've had to step out, into Vanessa Maria Graber and Kymone Freeman, and of course my good brother Stephen Bloom for all of this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And